So on behalf of myself and my co-director Paul McFlynn, who is there, I would like to welcome you all here today to the 10th in the annual series of Dónal Nevin lectures. In particular, I am delighted that Dónal's daughter Anne was able to join us. I would like to thank my colleague Louisa O'Brien for organising the event, to thank Imelda Wall and the CWU for hosting, and to thank Maxwell Photography for doing the photography and videography. Finally, I would like to thank our speakers here today. First of all, Brian O'Donovan, who is the work and technology correspondent, and of course, we all know him from his work as the Washington correspondent at RTE, for being so kind as to agree to chair. And of course, our keynote speaker and the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, Sharon Donnery, for what I know will be an insightful lecture titled Inflation and Labour Market Dynamics After the Pandemic. And of course, I would also like to thank the staff of the Central Bank who helped out and facilitated making this event happen. So I think you'll all agree it's a topic that is of immense importance and interest to all workers in Ireland. And then finally again, I would like to thank Congress President Kevin Callinan for agreeing to respond, and we're all very much looking forward to that. So we're thrilled to have you all, and I will pass you over now to our chair for the event, Brian O'Donovan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks for having me here today, everybody. It's great to be here. Former Washington correspondent, as you said, so I was glued to the midterms over the last few nights. I'm sure a lot of you were as well. And people always say to me that Irish people are more interested in American politics than Americans are. And having lived there, I can tell you it is true. We have a fascination with US politics, and it's been very, very interesting to watch. My new job is work and technology correspondent, as Tom said. So as part of that, I spent my day yesterday outside the offices of Meta, and I spent last night outside the offices of Meta reporting on their job losses. And as I stood there, I thought the same thing that's probably going through a lot of people's heads. Is this it? Is this the turning point? Is this some kind of moment in the Irish economy whereby after boom, after jobs growth, that we are staring towards something a lot more negative? Or is it, as a lot of people would say, a very unique tech-specific issue for a couple of unique specific companies for some very unique specific regions, and the fundamentals of the economy remain strong? And I know, while not the direct theme of today's discussion, the whole area of tech, the whole area of what's facing us will no doubt come up. And I mean, as I stood outside the Meta offices, I did think about all the contrasting things that we're facing right now. We are in a country where we have record revenues coming into the national coffers thanks to the massive corporation taxes that are being collected. We're near full employment. Many sectors have a shortage of staff and they're crying out for jobs. While at the same time, we're hit by these massive inflationary spikes, we're hit by rising interest rates, and we're staring down the barrel of a global economic slowdown. So lots of contrasting themes out there right now, lots of uncertainty about where things are going to go. To give you a little bit of a preview of what we're going to hear today, just to talk about the topic at hand, inflation and labour market dynamics after the pandemic. In response to persistent high inflation above its 2% target, the ECB raised interest rates for the first time in 11 years in July 22. Further increases are likely in the coming months. This lecture will discuss the reasons for high inflation, highlighting both pandemic-related supply shocks and strong pent-up demand, and how monetary policy is responding. As a key input price, wage dynamics are also, of course, a matter for inflation. The second part of the lecture will therefore look at post-pandemic labour market developments and consider the implications for both inflation and living standards. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. Sharon Donnery joined the Central Bank in 1996 as an economist in the Monetary Policy Division and has held a range of senior positions in the Central Bank since then. She was acting governor from the 1st of June 2019 to the 31st of August 2019. She has chaired a number of European committees, including being chair of the ECB high-level group on non-performing loans. She was previously Deputy Governor from the 1st of March 2016 to the 30th of June 2022 and was the Governor's alternate on the Governing Council of the ECB. She was appointed Deputy Governor for Financial Regulation on the 1st of July 2022. She's an ex officio member of the Central Bank Commission and is a member of the Supervisory Board of the European Central Bank. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today Sharon Donnery.
Just get the slides going and then I'll say good morning, just once we're technically ready to go.
Okay.
Okay, how's that looking? Excellent.
Super, thanks very much. So morning everyone, and thanks very much for the introduction, Brian, really appreciate it. Thanks also to the colleagues at the Nevin Economic Research Institute for the invitation, and to everybody in the background who's prepared and organised the event, and particularly for being quite patient with me, because of course I was supposed to be here a few weeks ago, and unfortunately, like many other people, I succumbed to COVID at exactly the wrong time, so I appreciate also the flexibility in being able to come back today. A special thanks to my colleague who's with me here today, Ray Lydon. He's done a huge amount of work and analysis and in terms of preparing my remarks and some of the data that we're going to share with you today. So for me, it is a real pleasure to be here today to give the Dónal Nevin lecture this year, and I'm really looking forward to Kevin's response and also hopefully the discussion that we have afterwards. Now, my aim in the lecture, as Brian was saying, is to give a perspective on what's driving the high levels of inflation that we're currently experiencing, and how labour market developments might influence that inflation outlook. And finally, of course, what that means for monetary policy. Now, I'm going to talk for about 40-45 minutes. I know that's a very long time. I hope I keep it interesting. But my remarks will be published, and these charts will also be published as well. So if anybody wants to look back at any of the data or the analysis that we've used today, it will obviously be available for you. So as Brian said in his opening remarks, I suppose the topics of inflation and labour market dynamics need little justification in the current context that we're working in, or indeed for this audience. But I do believe that they're really fitting topics for the Dónal Nevin lecture. Both of these issues were never far from the economic policy discussions that Dónal Nevin himself was involved in over his long career. And as a founding member and former president of the ESRI, and of course having served with distinction in the Department of Industry and Commerce and as General Secretary of ICTU before he retired, he was known as a man of great intellect and integrity, who of course devoted his life to public service. So in preparing for the lecture, I had a look at some of his contributions to the policy debates of the 70s and 80s. And I think it's clear that the challenges and some of the trade-offs that arise from trying to promote sustainable employment growth and better living standards without also fueling inflation was familiar territory at that time. Of course, the topics might be very familiar, but we should also be quite cautious, I think, about drawing too many historical parallels. Today, we operate in a very different economic environment to the one that confronted Dónal Nevin during much of his career. And from my own perspective, and given some of the issues that I'll discuss today, things like the fundamental changes in the institutional setup for monetary policy are one very obvious difference. The central bank is, of course, now one of 19 national central banks in the Eurosystem, soon to be 20 when Croatia joins the Eurozone, with price stability as the European Central Bank's primary objective. And of course, monetary policy is now set for the euro area as a whole. So in my remarks today, I'm going to talk a little bit about Ireland, but also euro area developments. Later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about what price stability means, but I suppose essentially it's about preserving the purchasing power of our euro by ensuring low, stable and predictable prices for the euro area as a whole. Now, I think as we all know, inflation during 2022 has been anything but low, or stable or predictable. So I'm going to talk a good deal about inflation, what the key drivers of inflation are and what we expect going forward. In the second part of the lecture then, I'm going to try and delve a bit more into the labour market developments and what they mean for inflation and wages. Inflation and labour markets are of course very closely linked through a variety of channels, such as labour market tightness, which we often think of in a Phillips curve framework, and expectations is another potential channel. Persistently high inflation can cause inflation expectations to drift upwards and then become entrenched in wage demands, making it even more challenging for us to hit our inflation target. Now, in both the euro area and in Ireland, employment is up sharply on its pre-pandemic levels. And as Brian said, unemployment rates are close to all-time lows. And despite a highly uncertain growth outlook, the number of job openings has remained high and large numbers of firms continue to report labour shortages. So how the labour market responds to a weakening growth outlook remains to be seen. But our current projections at the bank are that a tight labour market and real wage catch-up for the current bout of inflation will support nominal earnings growth of around 5 to 6% in Ireland in 2023 and 2024, and about 4 to 5% in the Eurozone. For the euro area at least, this level of wage growth is well above historic averages, and it's one of the reasons why underlying or so-called core inflation is expected to remain elevated in the near term before returning back towards our 2% target by 2024. However, I think it is worth pointing out that forecasting in such a volatile and uncertain world is extremely challenging. Inflation expectations are another aspect which also influence wage and price dynamics, because if higher inflation is expected to persist, workers naturally demand higher wages, and employers may then also in turn raise prices. So this kind of staggered adjustment in nominal wages and prices to preserve real wages and markups, the so-called wage price spiral, was very much a feature of macroeconomic and inflation dynamics in the 60s and 70s. Now, preempting some of what follows later in the lecture, I think my own view is that there's very little evidence of this kind of self-reinforcing wage price dynamic at the moment, either in Ireland or in the euro area. Now, this does not mean that we do not expect nominal wages to adjust to the very large price changes we've seen, and our research does show that this is happening across the euro area, albeit at a lag and not fully. So our current projections include allowances for some real wage catch-up, and this expected adjustment in real income has also fed into the bank's growth forecasts. What I don't see in the current data, though, is significant evidence of a shift in medium-term inflation expectations above our 2% target. If that were to happen, it could prompt a sort of self-reinforcing wage price dynamic with third and fourth round effects into wages and prices, and this would be akin, I think, to what proved so painful in the past. There is, I think, however, no room for complacency. In spite of raising interest rates and a weakening outlook, labour markets do remain tight, and inflation expectations have moved up somewhat alongside headline inflation. And this kind of momentum, combined with higher inflation expectations in the so-called tail of the distribution, indicate there is a greater risk of medium-term inflation expectations moving away from our 2% target. And were expectations to become disanchored in this kind of way, it would jeopardise our ability to sustainably achieve our medium-term inflation target. So preventing this from happening, kind of getting ahead of it, if you like, of any potential shift in inflation expectations, is one of the main reasons that the ECB has already started to raise policy rates. Now, in the final part of the lecture, I'll talk a little bit about policy choices and revisit this topic of inflation expectation. But let me start first with a reminder of how we ended up with high inflation in terms of what we're currently experiencing. Then, as I said, I'll discuss labour market developments, focusing on this issue of labour market tightness and what this might mean for wages. So, turning to inflation, and to begin just with some institutional background, which provides some context, I think, for when we think about policy later. So Ireland is a member of the Eurozone, and as such, the Central Bank of Ireland is one of 19 national central banks in the Eurosystem. And along with the other national governors from the national central banks and the European Central Bank's 6 executive board members, including President Lagarde and our former colleague Philip Lane, the governor is a member of the ECB's Governing Council. The Governing Council meets every 6 weeks or so to decide on monetary policy in order to achieve the ECB's primary price stability objective, which, as I said earlier, is set for the Eurozone as a whole. This Eurozone perspective means that our policy takes account of macroeconomic developments for the whole euro area. Now, being a member of the euro has obvious benefits, such as the promotion of trade and investment, both within the Eurozone and also outside the bloc. But our single monetary policy also means that at times, a given monetary stance may not be fully aligned to the economic conditions in every one of the 19 member state countries. So in these situations, other policy levers like domestic fiscal policy and national macroprudential policy, which is also set by the Central Bank of Ireland in our case, become even more important for ensuring domestic economic and financial stability. Now, in 2021, following a wide-ranging monetary policy strategy review, which included extensive public consultations as well, the Governing Council reaffirmed that price stability is best maintained by aiming for 2% inflation over the medium term. Now, this medium term time horizon for our objective is really important for 2 main reasons. First, it allows for a certain amount of flexibility in responding to economic shocks and taking into account of uncertainty in both the inflation process and the transmission of policy into the economy. And secondly, it allows for the possibility of temporary shocks dissipating of their own accord, so effectively without policy-inducing unnecessary volatility in either output or employment. This approach of sort of looking through temporary supply shocks has been, I would say, severely tested in the last 18 months. I think it could be argued, with the distinct benefit of hindsight, of course, that repeated supply shocks have basically combined with each other to produce a persistent supply shock that has effectively reduced output below its pre-pandemic potential for much longer than we first anticipated. When this was combined with a strong demand rebound, in part due to pandemic policies that had really preserved household income, the conditions were really set for a persistent and broad-based inflation, the inflation that we are now experiencing. Of course, the persistent, overlapping and unprecedented scale of the supply shocks were clearly not the sort of shocks we had in mind when we talked about this medium-term horizon in the strategy review. Who, for example, would have predicted a pandemic or even a war in Europe in 2022? What is clear, though, is that once the nature of the supply shocks became clearer, and importantly conditional on the strong demand that we also saw coming out of the pandemic, there is a role for monetary policy to react, to basically bring supply and demand back into balance and then sustainably return inflation to target. A commitment to our 2% inflation target is what is called symmetric, and that means that both negative and positive deviations are equally undesirable. Of course, the problem we currently have is not too low inflation. As we all know, headline inflation in October was 9.6% in Ireland and 10.7% in the euro area, and I think this is on the start of the slides now. We can contrast that with the last 10 years, up to December 2019, when inflation increased at an average annual rate of around 0.5% and 1.3% in the euro area. So a real contrast, I think, in the two time periods. So how did we get here? I think these current high rates of inflation are really the result of this series of overlapping shocks that have hit the global economy over the last 2.5 years, beginning with the onset of the pandemic in spring 2020. Economy-wide shutdowns disrupted production and distribution, leading to what we all know about these kind of widespread supply bottlenecks. Even before the start of the war in Ukraine, researchers had estimated that around half of euro area inflation and about 1/3 of US inflation in 2021 was driven by these supply shocks. Some of that reduction in supply was a response to the initial pandemic demand shock, as in the case of energy during 2021. But things like transport bottlenecks also hit supply, with delivery times reaching more than double their pre-pandemic levels, although this has eased somewhat during 2022. There were also some country-specific dimensions to the various restrictions and associated disruptions, China's zero COVID policy being one example. And interconnected supply chains meant these kind of ripples from supply bottlenecks were all global, and they were very slow to unwind. Now, a second shock or change that really matters for what's happened in inflation is pandemic-related shifts in the composition of demand, so what makes up demand. The initial shift, of course, was away from services when spending opportunities were restricted because of lockdowns, so away from services and towards goods. This change in the composition of spending was particularly large in some countries, such as the US. And our own tracking at the Central Bank of Irish consumer spending, using high-frequency card spending data, showed similar changes during 2020 and 2021, with a very strong rebound in services during 2022 as that last set of restrictions were lifted. A feature of the post-pandemic recovery was also a surge in demand that occurred in many global economies at more or less the same time. Strong demand, which also spilled over geographically, only served to put further pressure on these already stretched global supply chains. So goods inflation, which accounts for about a quarter of the consumer spending basket, is currently far above its historical averages, at around 5% in Ireland and around 5.5% in the euro area. For Ireland, where goods deflation had put downward pressure on overall inflation for much of the last 2 decades, this is a huge swing, and we have some slides here on the components of inflation. The third shock, of course, was Russia's war of aggression against the Ukraine, which I would say, quite apart from the devastating consequences for the people of Ukraine, has also exacerbated global inflationary pressures and supply-side constraints, particularly in energy and food commodity inputs. The euro area, of course, is a net importer of energy. Therefore, the scale of the energy price changes we're facing, which are up around 40% in the last year, constitute an unprecedented terms of trade shock for the euro area. Effectively, we are all simply significantly worse off as a result of what's happened. And of course, some groups in society are more affected, especially those for whom energy and food account for a greater share of spending. We all know, for example, that lower income and older households are particularly vulnerable, something that I'll return to when I talk about policy a bit later. So given the common nature of these shocks that are driving inflation, as well as this issue of global interconnectedness of inputs and outputs, it's unsurprising that Irish inflation has moved broadly in line with the euro area average in recent months. Now, this was not always the case, such as previous inflationary episodes in the early 2000s and deflationary domestic-driven episodes, particularly after the financial crisis. And some euro area countries are experiencing even higher rates of inflation, notably the Baltic countries, where import trade links with Russia were stronger before the war, including for energy, for example. Now, despite accounting for around a tenth of consumer spending basket, almost half of euro area headline inflation in 2022 is directly related to energy. However, as energy is also an input into the production of so many other goods and services, energy price shocks also indirectly impact on non-energy inflation rates as costs are rising in general. So these energy cost push linkages are strongest, of course, for food production, and then a wide range of energy-intensive manufacturing goods and also for transport services. Commodity price increases are also contributing to higher food prices. Global supply bottlenecks and indirect effects of energy prices have also contributed to higher food commodity prices even before the war in Ukraine. However, following the invasion and reflecting Russia and Ukraine's role as a major supplier of raw food inputs, commodity and producer prices also spiked again. And these pipeline price pressures are basically still trickling through into the food supply chain. Our own internal estimates at the bank is that this pass-through of commodity price changes peak at around 6 to 12 months, but they continue to influence consumer price developments up to 24 months later. So looking ahead, commodity prices have since come down a bit more, reflecting both substitution and the reopening of some supply routes. But high inflation is a broad-based phenomenon. As of September, more than 80% of the items in the Irish basket were increasing by more than 2%, with similar figures in the euro area. And this share is up from about 20% of items in the basket before the pandemic. So this kind of broadening of inflation is driving up core inflation. That is inflation excluding energy and food, which was 4.8% in the euro area and 5.1% in Ireland in September. Now, I'm emphasising this concept of core inflation trends because for monetary policymakers, it's a really important metric for a couple of reasons. First of all, headline or overall inflation can be very volatile. And historically, at least, the most volatile components of headline inflation tend to be the least persistent. So policymakers try to pay close attention to these measures of more underlying inflation or core inflation. Underlying measures indicate where headline inflation could settle after the sort of short-term factors fade out. And of course, this is very relevant for the medium-term orientation of monetary policy that I explained earlier. So for the euro area, for example, private sector forecasters expect core inflation to average around 4% in both 2022 and 2023, before falling back to around 2.6% in 2024. The ECB's own projections, the most recent being from September 2022, show core inflation at around 2.3% in 2024. Although this does still include some residual second round effects, basically still working their way through to prices. Now, those September 2022 projections will be updated at the December Governing Council meeting when the national central banks, including my colleagues at the bank, will produce our own forecasts, which will basically all be amalgamated together to complete the euro area picture. Now, the second reason we care about this underlying or core inflation is because historically it has tended to move very closely with wages. So in assessing this cost push inflation drivers, wage developments are a really important consideration, particularly wage growth that is over and above labour productivity growth. A wide range of other non-wage costs are also relevant, as recent developments have shown. So let me be clear, I'm not saying that wage pressures are not the primary driver of the current bout of high inflation. What we clearly want to avoid is a situation where once the current supply shocks abate, domestic wage pressures are a factor in contributing to inflation remaining above its target over the medium term. And maybe that's a timely point to move on to talk a little bit about labour market developments. So the outbreak of the pandemic ended one of the longest continuous employment expansions on record between 2013 and 2020. Employment grew in all but a handful of quarters. Net inward migration was a key driver in these trends. So between 2015 and 2019, Net migration, many of whom were of working age, totaled 110,000 people, which is a very large number in the context of an increase in overall employment of around 263,000 in that same time period. In 2018, employment returned to its pre-financial crisis levels, albeit with a very different composition, notably a much lower concentration in the construction sector. And by end 2019, wage growth was beginning to pick up again, and in fact there were concerns over a risk of overheating dynamics which were emerging in the context of a tightening labour market and very strong domestic demand, and those concerns were even called out in our own central bank quarterly bulletin at that time. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the labour market impact of the pandemic itself. This is not to minimise how large a negative shock it was and how badly certain groups in society were affected, nor to gloss over some of the policy innovations that evolved really rapidly at that time to deal with the shocks. Rather, for today, I want to take a more forward-looking perspective, beginning with the rebound in the labour market after the pandemic, how this has led to a tight labour market now, and what this might mean for wages. So the rollout of vaccines and then the gradual withdrawal of restrictions saw total employment surpass its pre-pandemic trend by the end of 2021. And the latest labour force survey for Q2 2022 puts employment at 2.55 million, almost 250,000 above pre-pandemic levels. Although as average hours tend to be lower, at least in the initial phase of the recovery, total hours worked is now only approaching its pre-pandemic trend, which you can also see in this slide. Now, reflecting in part lingering pandemic effects on both demand and supply, this recovery was very uneven across different sectors. So total hours worked in contact-intensive jobs, like in the accommodation and food sector and other services, remain below pre-pandemic levels. Overall, however, weaker employment growth in this kind of handful of sectors has been more than offset by significantly stronger growth in a number of other sectors, notably IT, which is obviously very topical at the moment, and Brian did mention that, also education, professional services, construction, finance, and wider industry. As highlighted in our recent quarterly bulletin, the expansion of employment in the last 2 years has been fuelled by a large expansion in the labour force, which grew from 2.43 million to 2.68 million between 2019 and 2022. This increase in labour force participation in the main from already resident working age populations more than offset the temporary decline that we saw in net migration in 2021 due to the pandemic. Labour force participation rates in Ireland have increased right across the age distribution, although increases for women, which is up about 4 percentage points to 60%, and younger and older workers are particularly large, which you can also see in the slide. Our own research at the bank shows that this participation expansion is supporting employment growth, and it's mostly explained by two factors. Firstly, this tighter labour market I talked about, which has boosted participation, particularly among younger age cohorts who are much more sensitive to prevailing economic conditions. And secondly, longer run trend increases in participation for some groups. And in relation to this latter long run trend increase, our analysis suggests that higher levels of participation by women could be sustained, providing a boost to overall labour supply and supporting economic growth over the medium term. The participation gains for those under 25 could also be maintained as these cohorts are contributing labour alongside educational attainment. However, this activity is much more sensitive to the economic cycle. We do see some similar changes in labour force participation in other euro area countries, which, when combined with falling unemployment rates, are contributing to higher employment rates in some countries such as France, the Netherlands, Italy and Spain. A key question, of course, is will these labour supply effects persist? Will they fade out as the pandemic rebound eases? Are they structural or cyclical changes? Our current analysis of the Irish data suggests to us that cyclical factors are dominating. However, the pandemic has induced a rapid and significant shift in long-established work practices, notably the increase in working from home for jobs where this is possible. And whilst we've not seen any evidence yet of increased incidence of working from home as being the kind of dominant factor explaining this increase in labour force participation, we should consider some of the potential longer-term effects of the greater use of flexible working. For example, we know from research that women are more likely to work from home than men. In Ireland, 1 in 4 workers now say they mainly work from home, up from just 1 in 14 pre-pandemic. Working from home is also much more common among certain cohorts of the population. So, for example, 40% of workers aged 40 plus say they work at least sometimes at home, compared with just 20% of workers under 25. And almost 50% of workers in the top quartile of the wage distribution work at home, compared with 25% of workers in the bottom quartile of the distribution. The implications of more home working, though, go beyond labour supply. It could also matter for wages if the increased amenity value of working from home is shared between employees and employers. So what do I mean by this concept of amenity value? Well, it includes many things: the benefits of reduced commuting time, greater ability to flexibly plan how you use your day, more autonomy in work, less traffic-related stress, and so on. In the US, researchers have been attempting to quantify these amenity values for workers and find that they range from about 1.5% to 7% of earnings as you move up along the pay distribution. The potential impact of all of this on wages is via wage bargaining, as employers and employees increasingly bargain over the value of the option to work from home. The upshot of all of this is that increased working from home could be reflected in lower wage levels than would otherwise be the case, with, of course, implications for wages, the distribution of market income, and ultimately labour shares. These are, of course, essentially arguments about the wage level as opposed to wage growth. Beyond working from home, there are, of course, other forms of flexibility that were introduced in response to the pandemic, which could also impact the labour market. For example, we have highlighted more remote education and training opportunities as a potential force for increased labour force participation for certain groups. We're already seeing this in the share of under 25s who are working while also in education, which in recent quarters has risen from pre-pandemic levels. Now, we saw similar high cyclical rates of youth labour force participation during the mid-2000s. However, there is one important difference now, which is that more of these workers are now combining both education and work, whereas previously it was more a case of leaving education for work. Sector shifts, that is, things like fewer construction workers, is likely part of the reason for this, in addition also to greater opportunities for remote work and study. Now, beyond the income benefit to these workers, there are also potential longer-term benefits of being able to combine both work and training. One, of course, is higher average labour market productivity, and another is shorter unemployment durations in the event of a job separation, which could in turn have implications for cyclical unemployment dynamics. Turning now to the outlook for wages. The near-term outlook for wages depends on 3 interconnected factors: tightness of the labour market and how it's expected to evolve, how much and over what time period will employers adjust nominal wages to reflect the current bout of inflation that we see. In other words, what's the real wage catch-up, which itself also depends partly on labour market tightness. And then thirdly, the future path for inflation and how this impacts inflation expectations and future wage demands. So notwithstanding the deterioration in the outlook during 2020, due in large part to a hit in our real incomes for inflation, indicators continue to point to a very tight labour market. Unemployment rate is either at or very close to historical lows in many euro area countries, and reports of labour shortages by firms still persist. The number of job openings, or the job vacancy rate, has retained much of its post-pandemic high and around 50% above pre-pandemic levels. The boost in demand for pandemic-related jobs, notably in delivery and transport of goods, has been particularly strong. And whilst the total number of job openings has held up so far in Ireland, we do see declines in some sectors, such as technology-related jobs, which is following a similar decline in the US, and we have this here on the slide. This inevitably, of course, brings both uncertainty and challenges for individuals and households, as we've seen in very stark terms this week. Now, this inverse relationship between job vacancies here plotted on the y-axis and unemployment can be shown in the so-called Beveridge curve, which is here for the euro area on this slide. Cyclical economic variation is marked by movements along this curve, whereas structural changes, such as changing in job matching efficiency, for example, shift the position of the curve. Our reading of the recent data for the euro area and Ireland point to cyclical factors as the main drivers of labour market tightness, which supports the case for higher interest rates to sustainably bring inflation back to our 2% target. But what's happening to wages in this environment? So first, I think it's useful to look back a little bit at wage dynamics before the pandemic. Up to 2019, nominal wages were growing at a rate of inflation plus 1%. This meant that real wages were broadly tracking domestic productivity growth, which according to the CSO also averaged about 1% up to the year 2020. For this year, as we outlined in our October quarterly bulletin, we're projecting average nominal wage growth of 3.8%, accelerating to 5.8% in 2023, before falling back a little to 4.9% in 2024. A combination of tighter labour market and this real wage catch-up are driving this growth. Thus, the expectation is for more real wage catch-up to occur in 2023 and 2024, but real wage growth to be negative in the short term. And this is consistent with other survey evidence collected by the bank, which showed that the majority of workers expect their wages to increase less than inflation during 2022. Despite considerable uncertainty for the overall economic outlook for the euro area, nominal wages in the euro area are also projected to grow at around double the historical rate. So at 4%, 4.8% and 4% again in 2022, 2023 and 2024. Emphasising the scale of the challenge facing both workers and firms in adjusting to the price shock in both Ireland and the euro area, cumulative real wage growth is still projected to be negative on average by 2024, around -3% in both cases. So how do these projections compare with our latest data? Well, for Ireland, national accounts estimates show growth in compensation per employee of around 2.8% in the second quarter of this year. Other estimates from the CSO from firm surveys, for example, give a somewhat similar figure of around 2.7%, also for the second quarter of this year, up from 2% in quarter one. One potential issue with these figures is that they do not take account of significant changes in the composition of employment as we emerge from the pandemic, and this could skew the wage growth estimates somewhat. So to filter out some of these compositional changes, the CSO also reports on estimates that condition on the same worker in both Q2 2021 and a year later in Q2 2022, not necessarily in the same job, but the same worker. This gives a very strong estimate of 9.3% for annual wage growth for Q2 2022. For the euro area as a whole, the ECB's wage growth tracker is based on negotiated wages, and the latest observation for the annual growth rate in negotiated wages in the euro area for the second quarter of this year is 2.14%, down from 2.84% in the first quarter. Now, from the perspective of understanding current and future wage dynamics, none of these measures are perfect, with potential issues with all of them relating to composition, coverage and representativeness. Another drawback with the ECB negotiated wage series in particular is that it tends to lag economic developments by several quarters. So to complement these official wage data, as well as to try to get a more timely and forward-looking picture of wage developments, we also analyse trends in posted wages in job ads using data from the job site Indeed. And you may have seen some coverage of this research that we published yesterday. So in the current tight labour market, wages of potential new hires has received a lot of attention, both as a kind of leading indicator of average wage growth in the economy and also as an indicator of so-called labour market tightness. The wage tracker was built to be responsive. Available shortly after the end of each month, it is much more timely than the other existing sources we have, and it can help shed light on future trends because it tells us how much employers expect and indeed are willing to pay to hire an additional worker. So post-pandemic, growth in posted wages has picked up sharply. As of October 2022, we estimate annual growth in posted wages of just under 4.7% in Ireland and about 5.2% for the euro area. Given its contribution to overall employment, the euro area trend is heavily influenced by wage growth in Germany, which hit 7.1% per year in October. In Ireland, wage growth in recent months has either plateaued or slowed, suggesting that employers may be taking stock of the weaker demand outlook. So in the same way that we think about how broad are price pressures, we can also analyse how broad are these wage growth trends. In the year to October, 6 out of 10 occupational categories in Ireland and the euro area saw wage growth in excess of 3%, a rate of nominal wage growth that's roughly consistent with a 2% inflation target plus 1% productivity growth. This share is well above the 2019 average, where it was 4 out of 10 occupational groups, and suggests that higher wage growth is becoming more spread out rather than being driven by a small number of job categories where supply and demand balances is particularly tight. Such a broadening of upward price pressure could be evidence of these growing second round effects of energy and food price shocks from inflation, and is no doubt a trend that we will be paying close attention to in the coming months. So, in my conclusion, I'm going to talk a little bit about the outlook for inflation, focusing on the main drivers that I already mentioned. And on the policy front, I'll talk briefly about distributional aspects of high inflation and what this might mean for fiscal policy. But my main focus will be on the task monetary policy makers face in bringing inflation back to target. When inflation is high, it tends to be unstable and hard to predict. And so it has proven with the ECB's own projections. And the ECB is not alone in this. We've systematically underpredicted even the near-term path for inflation in recent quarters. Much of the underprediction is from the unexpected energy price shocks. And in these circumstances, it has made sense, I think, to include scenario analysis alongside our baseline projections, as the ECB has done recently. However, it's not only volatile energy prices that explain these underforecasts. I think at least initially there was also an underappreciation of other inflation drivers that I talked about earlier on, such as the shift from services to goods and the persistence of the supply shocks and the bottlenecks, that all of which combined with strong pent-up demand. In the near term, the energy crisis will continue to support higher price levels while also being negative for growth. But the base effects of this will recede, and conditional on future shocks, I would expect the upward pressure on inflation from energy to ease considerably. Some of the other pandemic-related factors that also increased inflation are easing. Energy aside, global supply chain pressures have eased considerably since the start of 2022. And in the transport sector, for example, shipping costs, while still above pre-pandemic levels, are on more of a downward trajectory. Consumer demand is also rebalancing back towards services, helped in no small part from a post-pandemic boost to travel. And this is reducing some of the demand pressure on goods. We already see signs of this in our own central bank credit card spending data. In addition, the shock to real incomes from nominal wages lagging inflation will further reduce the demand for goods, putting further downward pressure on goods prices. And this is already evident in things like retail sales volumes, which have been falling in recent months, as has the month-on-month pace of goods inflation. Food commodity prices like wheat have fallen back since June, which hopefully will ease pipeline food price pressures. Although here I do urge caution. Unexpected geopolitical events, including in relation to energy inputs, as well as the increased occurrence of extreme climate events, continue to be a significant risk factor for food prices. Even in the scenario of no future input price food shocks, food price levels are unlikely to fall rapidly or indeed soon. And furthermore, as I mentioned before, the full pass-through of input cost increases for the full year have not been seen as yet. Now, the main risk factor against an easing of inflation pressures is probably energy. In the current environment, energy prices, especially for gas and electricity, are basically unforecastable. Nevertheless, they represent the most significant upside and downside risks to inflation and growth, respectively. Notwithstanding efforts to rebuild gas supply buffers for the winter, supply cuts could further spike wholesale prices, including for the winter of 2023. And how all of this plays out for consumers will in part depend on the response of national governments, as well as the moves at European level to reform the design of the European electricity market. Analysis of adverse energy shortage scenarios by the ECB and others are highly negative for growth, lowering GDP by 0.4% to 2.2% relative to the baseline. And at present, we appear closer to the more benign end of this range, a scenario which is highly reliant on a large build-up of winter 2022 storage, including via significant LNG substitution and an assumption of a milder winter. Against the backdrop of high inflation, rising central bank interest rates and geopolitical uncertainty, the growth outlook has of course deteriorated sharply, and soft indicators and GDP nowcasts all point to weakening euro area growth. These forces will act against rising inflation, as well as the ability of workers to obtain higher wages. With a weaker economic outlook, firms will be more circumspect about raising prices for fear of losing their customers. and equally workers' demands for higher wages will need to be carefully balanced against the risk of potentially rising unemployment. But for the time being at least, this is far from a gloomy labour market outlook. As I've shown, labour market demand has thus far remained strong, even in the face of this weaker growth outlook. One possibility is that firms are anticipating a relatively short slowdown in growth, and recent experience of labour shortages is leading to labour hoarding. We also know that historically the labour market is a lagging indicator, often reacting to economic developments several quarters afterwards. So much will also depend on the depth and the duration of any slowdown and how policy responds, which brings me to the final part of this lecture and the policy outlook. The central bank has addressed fiscal policy in recent publications in great detail, so I'll keep my comments on fiscal policy very short today. In terms of helping households that are facing a large increase in their cost of living, the policy priority has to be those groups in society that are most vulnerable to rising inflation. This means that with a limited budget, help gets to those that need it most. It also ensures that any additional inflationary pressure from policy itself in this area is minimised. So who are these vulnerable groups? Well, analysis by both the central bank and the CSO shows quite clearly who is most affected by the current higher rates of inflation. They're low-income households, older households, and within these groups, those who are renting their home. The difference between low and high income households is particularly stark, with a swing of over 2 percentage points in the inflation rate in June, driven by significantly higher contributions from energy, food and rent. The last decade or so of low interest rates contributed to the so-called search for yield that drove up many asset values, including housing. In addition, the demands on the sovereign during the pandemic added to a further build-up of debt. Indebted households and firms are also exposed in an environment of tightening monetary policy and financial conditions more generally. As outlined in our recent financial stability review, household vulnerabilities are somewhat different to what we saw at the onset of the financial crisis in Ireland. Household resilience now is underpinned by debt levels that have fallen steadily over the last decade, an increased reliance on long-term fixed rates that leaves fewer borrowers exposed to rate rises in the shorter term, as well as some households holding considerably liquidity buffers or savings that were built up during the pandemic. The rapid tightening of global financial conditions on foot of changes in the monetary policy stance have led to a significant repricing of financial assets and an increase in market volatility. These impacts could affect the Irish economy and financial system through a number of channels, including higher risk premia for sovereign debt and higher financing costs for Irish resident corporate firms. And on the former, the sovereign, recent events in the UK highlight the importance of a commitment to sustainable and credible fiscal policy over the medium term. So, with both headline and core inflation at very high levels, central bank credibility is on the line. It's no surprise, therefore, and quite right in my view, that the common theme in monetary policy in most advanced economies is a clear and resolute commitment to bring inflation back in line with target. So how can that be achieved? So let me just briefly summarise the ECB perspective focusing on interest rates. Since July, the Governing Council has raised interest rates by 2%. Having started at minus 50 basis points, this means the effective policy rate is now 1.5%. These changes mark a rapid move away from the accommodative stance that characterised the post-financial crisis period of low inflation, as well as the monetary policy response to the pandemic. For future interest rate changes, the Governing Council has said clearly it will assess the incoming data in terms of what it means for the outlook and the required path of interest rates to achieve our inflation target. Such a data-dependent, or the so-called meeting-by-meeting approach, is appropriate, I think, given the highly uncertain economic environment we face. It represents a significant departure from the more forward guidance-dominated approach that characterised the period after the financial crisis and pandemic monetary policy. Forward guidance being a part of our toolkit that is more suitable to periods when we face the constraints of the so-called effective lower bound, when interest rates are close or below zero. What is clear at the current juncture is that our current rate rising cycle still has some way to go. This was made clear by the Governing Council in October, when it signalled that further increases in interest rates would likely to be warranted at future meetings. Financial markets have taken note, pricing in successive rate rises to around 3% by around this time next year. And while financial conditions have quickly adjusted, with interest on loans to households and firms in the euro area increasing sharply since the beginning of the year, it will take some time for this impact of rising rates to filter through more broadly to economic activity. This is the oft-mentioned long and variable lag of monetary policy, and it's another motivating reason for our meeting-by-meeting gradual approach to the calibration of our policy. On the pace of adjustment and the likely end point for rate rises in this cycle, I think this will be very much informed by incoming data on inflation, wage growth, expectations and financial conditions. If medium-term inflation expectations were to show a consistent sign of drifting away from our 2% inflation target, this would strengthen the case for a tighter policy stance. When we look at the central tendency of medium-term market inflation expectations, it remains around 2%, as you can see here in the slide. Having said that, there is an increasing mass in the right tail of the distribution, as seen also in the survey of professional forecasters in June, and this is potentially significant if some, as some have argued, these so-called early movers are the first signs of an upward drift in the inflation anchor. Consumer expectations have also drifted up alongside actual inflation, currently around 3% for expected inflation 3 years ahead. Now, I've covered a lot of topics today. There's a lot of charts, but that's an economist for you, I guess. As I conclude my remarks, I cannot help but put the challenges that we face today, though, in a wider historical context, including the challenges that Dónal Nevin and others faced in the 70s and 80s. While I said earlier historical parallels are dangerous, I think the one constant is that the predominant aim of public servants, past and present, is to serve the public good through analysis that best informs policy decisions. I hope what I've set out today gives you a sense of the challenges faced through our informed perspective on inflation and labour market developments and how these might inform our monetary policy. I hope I've done that, and I look forward very much to the discussion. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Sharon. I thought that was really excellent. I loved the charts. Don't apologise for all the charts. They were great. So much to unpack there. I thought you went into great detail about energy, and everybody's so focused on energy and saying, oh, this inflation is driven by energy, but you say energy, it affects everything. It affects food, it affects transport, it's everywhere. So it's driving up the inflationary spike. The tech slowdown, I was very interested, something we're going to talk about, I'm sure, later. Remote working potentially leading to a pay cut. Kevin Callinan, I'm sure you'd have something to say about that. And the hoarding of staff. I'm going to hire loads of people now because I'm afraid there'll be another staff crunch, so I'll hoard them for the better. I find that absolutely fascinating. Anyway, these are areas that we'll all unpack, I'm sure, in a little while. But it's fine. Time now to get the official response, and that is going to come from a man who I usually interview at 5 o'clock in the morning, bleary-eyed, outside the Workplace Relations Commission after a bruising round of pay talks with the government. Kevin Callinan is the president of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and the general secretary of the Fórsa trade union. He's currently leading the public sector pay talks, as I said, on the union side. He was formerly the deputy general secretary of Fórsa and before that, Impact. He's a former activist in Dublin Corporation. He has served as a trade union organiser, official and national secretary in the health sector, the civil service, education and local government. Ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Callinan.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, first of all, I want to take this opportunity as President of Congress to welcome you all to the Nevin Economic Research Institute's Dónal Nevin Lecture. And in particular to thank our speaker, Sharon Donnery, for her insightful and timely contribution, which I thought was simultaneously erudite, well-researched, and accessible. And I gather that some of the credit should go to yourself, Ray Lydon of the Central Bank as well. And of course to Brian O'Donovan for, as he says, we normally meet in different circumstances, for chairing our discussion today. And as Tom said earlier, I'd also like to extend a special welcome to Dónal's daughter Anne and to send our best wishes to Dónal's wife Maura, who wasn't able to join us today. This is the 10th Dónal Nevin lecture, and I want to acknowledge the time and the effort that has gone into organising the event over the last decade. Dónal Nevin was a visionary leader of our movement, who saw the imperative for scholarship and research to be at the heart of modern trade unionism. Therefore, it's only fitting that we come together every year to honour his legacy along with the institute that bears his name. The annual lecture began 10 years ago when Uachtar na hÉireann, Michael D. Higgins, spoke of the grave challenges that faced Ireland in the aftermath of the financial crash and how to rebuild an economy based on compassion, solidarity and sustainability. In the years that followed, we've tried to explore these issues in greater depth. We've had lectures on the task of reimagining public investment with Professor Mariana Mazzucato, the future of the banking system with Professor Stephanie Griffith-Jones, the shortcomings of GDP with Professor Diane Coyle, and the moral necessity of preventing destruction of our climate with Dr. Lorna Gold. Topics such as Brexit, fiscal devolution in Northern Ireland, the future of work, and the history of Ireland's economic development have all provided further impetus to this programme. So, 10 years on, we meet again in the midst of yet another significant economic crisis. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions understands the gravity of the situation that confronts us, and we know better than most how this crisis is affecting households in real time. Protecting incomes from rising prices is the bread and butter of any trade unionist, and we will never apologise for it. However, we also understand that when inflation reaches extreme levels, attempting to outrun it can be a fool's errand. We understand the necessity to stabilise the price level and to assert control over inflation. Protecting the incomes of our members and seeking stability for our economy are not mutually exclusive goals, but achieving them together requires a delicate balance. So tackling the current crisis entails being honest about it and reminding ourselves how we have reached this point. The process of closing down our economy while preserving incomes and then reopening it was bound to lead to pent-up demand and therefore to higher inflation. But the scale of price increases we are seeing now cannot be fully or even primarily blamed on excess demand. The most obvious and pressing factor is the situation, as Sharon has mentioned, regarding energy supply in Europe. The war in Ukraine has exposed the depth of our reliance on imported fossil fuels and the inadequacy of the efforts in Ireland and in the rest of Western Europe, it has to be said, to build renewable energy capacity. The job of restructuring our production and our use of energy is more vital now than ever if we are to tackle the structural causes of the current crisis. But the supply issues that have instigated this crisis go beyond energy. The housing crisis in this country represents an act of self-sabotage that we can no longer afford to ignore. Yes, the war in Ukraine has had a huge impact, but we are also paying the price for years of inaction on cost of living issues that have been compounded over the years that preceded it. What will happen to prices over the next 18 months? Most forecasters project inflation of 8% or thereabouts this year, followed by further price increases of between 6 and 7% next year. In his budget speech on the 27th of September, the Minister for Finance significantly revised the government's forecast for next year from 3% to 7.1%. The reality is that enormous uncertainty, as Sharon has said, surrounds the future path of price inflation in the months ahead, particularly given the unknown duration of the Ukraine and path of the Ukraine war and its fallout in terms of energy and food prices and in terms of supply chain disruptions. How should monetary policy respond? We understand that monetary policy needs to be tightened, but it's crucial that the ECB do not go too far too fast. The ECB must remain alert for potential long-term damage to the labour market and productive capacity. The consequences of higher inflation must be weighed against the socio-economic and political economy consequences of a recession. Rising interest rates and falling confidence will temper demand. This will reduce the mismatch with supply. But it will also result in business failures and higher unemployment. And reflecting back on my earlier remarks, and indeed Sharon's acknowledgement of the situation in her lecture, one can't help thinking about the mismatch too between Irish conditions and ECB policy during the financial crash. We can't countenance a similar situation again if it is as damaging to Ireland. So it's crucial to understand that the current crisis does not affect all households equally. Low and fixed income groups are at a greatly increased risk of energy poverty and deprivation this winter and indeed next winter. On the other hand, higher income groups are starting out from a position of strength and have been enjoying record levels of household savings. In general, higher income groups will therefore be better able to absorb the cost of living increase without much difficulty or too much difficulty by reducing their rate of savings. It's a more mixed picture for households towards the middle of the income distribution. Households have different spending patterns. CSO analysis tells us that the poorest 20% of households experienced the highest price increases in the year to June. Price inflation for these groups, again, as has been noted in the lecture, was about 2 percentage points higher than price inflation for the richest 20% of households. It seems that the weakest shoulders have the most to bear. Renters, lone parents, those aged over 65, and rural households are all being disproportionately affected. So, again, I fully concur with Sharon's assessment on that particular issue. The benefits of the higher prices are mainly being exported. This means the country as a whole is poorer. It should be evident that the focus of the policy response must be carefully targeted at those households that are most in need. Most importantly, we must also be careful that in seeking to help the most vulnerable, we do not reach for policies that undermine our climate goals just because they are expedient. The Budget 2023, represented an opportunity for government to bring stability and to provide support in this crisis. We knew that government could not shield all households from the rising cost of living, but it did have the power to both provide support where it was genuinely needed and to change course for the future. The first priority should have been to ensure that there is no rise in the number of households experiencing deprivation. We're a rich country and we had the resources to do this with the public finances in a strong position. I think it's significant this morning that Sharon has recognised the need for fiscal policy to prioritise the most vulnerable. The poorest households could have been fully insulated from the rise in prices with social protection rates and the minimum wage at least matching headline inflation in order to protect real incomes and living standards. Unfortunately, the emphasis on once-off payments will mean that households reliant on social welfare are likely to experience average income losses and an erosion of real purchasing power. On the other hand, the government's decision to cut income taxes for middle and higher earners will not only add to inflationary pressures, but will generally do nothing for most of the households experiencing income adequacy issues due to the cost of living crisis. It's hard to conceive of a worse way to use up precious fiscal resources during such a crisis, or indeed a more economically illiterate way to attempt to tackle spiralling inflation at a time of close to full employment and constrained supply. Low-paid workers were the big losers in the budget, as they generally won't benefit from the tax cuts or from the welfare increases. If anything, we should be counter-cyclically increasing taxes on high-income groups and especially on wealth and capital income. Congress supports the position of the Commission on Taxation and Welfare that taxes will have to rise in these areas. And at a personal level, I am very disappointed at the way in which that report was responded to from within government on the day it landed, given that it was the government itself that established the Commission. Congress had urged the government to use Budget 2023 as an opportunity to radically reduce the cost of using public services in areas such as education, healthcare, public transport, public housing services and childcare. Increased subsidies or greater increased subsidies or reduced charges in these areas would have helped to push the cost of living downwards. In the medium term, we need to build on our collective economic and social infrastructure and enhance our resilience through greater funding of universal public services. Unlike cuts to income tax, such an approach would have helped dampen inflationary pressures. Medium-term cost of living measures ought to focus on areas where Ireland is out of line with other countries. Good examples include childcare, housing, insurance and legal costs, areas that have been highlighted certainly for all my time, 7 years from 2015 on the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council. This brings me to wages. I mentioned earlier that in order to tackle this cost of living crisis, we have to be honest about what caused it. Well, by the same logic, we also have to be honest about what did not cause the crisis. It was not caused by workers making outrageous pay demands, nor was it caused by hardworking families spending to excess. It's important that Sharon has stated, indeed, that there's no evidence to suggest that wages, at this stage, that wages are driving inflation. I think it's important to reiterate these points because a dangerous narrative has been allowed to develop where workers seeking their fair share of profits are somehow blamed for exacerbating the cost of living crisis. This proposition is as flawed as it is insulting. Firstly, I still find it astonishing that newspaper columns and other economic commentators can moralize at length about what they consider excessive wage demands, but are curiously mute when it comes to excessive profits. Let's be very clear, there are companies that are making a lot of money during periods of inflation. Those companies can either pass that dividend on to workers or they can take it as profit. Workers making pay claims are only seeking their fair share. The idea that without these wage demands, companies would simply lower prices does not stand up to basic scrutiny. The second issue has been mentioned by Sharon already. A wage price spiral represents a failure of policy across the board. And Congress is clear that such a scenario is not in the interest of workers or the economy as a whole. Having said that, we also need to be clear about what a wage price spiral is. Much of our discussion on this is peppered with anecdotes from the 1970s, the last time we experienced such a dynamic. And I've found it disappointing this year that a lot of senior politicians, seem to rely on just a lazy, reference to that without really interrogating what's happening. We do well to recall the facts before making any sort of direct comparison. Back then, inflation was truly out of control, and crucially, no arm of government seemed to have any idea how to tame it. This level of uncertainty leads to pay claims that seek to far outrun current inflation because longer-term expectations of inflation are even higher. Whilst our current situation is serious, we are not dealing with the same degree of uncertainty in the longer term. Therefore, pay claims are not seeking to outrun inflation. They're only seeking to mitigate it. This is a very different dynamic. What this also tells us that it is crucial that we preserve that perspective. Government must show that it has the capacity to tackle the structural issues that have led to the crisis. And monetary authorities must show that they can exercise their policy tools without causing unnecessary harm to the economy. Preventing a wage price spiral is a responsibility for us all, but this requires us to work together. The fact is, notwithstanding its positive contribution to the COVID pandemic response, the quality of Irish social dialogue is not at the level required to meet the challenge we face. If that doesn't change forthwith, we're likely to see a very different scenario emerge. I find it somewhat remarkable that the leader of the main business and employer organisation has been consistently calling for a new social compact based on moderate wage growth, industrial peace, and increased taxation to fund public services and welfare benefits. He reiterated this call a few weeks ago in his Countess Markievicz Memorial Lecture at Dublin City University. The government intervention in Budget 2023 was hugely significant in the scale of the spend, but it was a missed opportunity to start bringing about the transformative change that would have provided the necessary resilience to withstand the inevitable shocks, not just as a result of the cost of living crisis, that a small, open economy such as Ireland will face. In framing its budgetary approach, any government is dealing in the citizens' own resources or liabilities. Looking ahead to next year, the trade union movement will not accept a continued failure to deploy such measures in a more targeted way. Neither can we tolerate a failure to deploy resources to strengthen our public services. We've all seen the economic damage caused by the recent inappropriate taxation measures announced in Britain. Ultimately, this affects ordinary people. Our own government's recent income tax adjustments are more moderate by comparison, but they remain at odds with the direction of travel that all of the wise and informed signals are beckoning us towards. I want to be clear here. A tripartite approach, a new social compact, is by far the best means at our disposal to face the considerable challenges ahead. If that's to happen, the ball is firmly in the government's court, because we in the trade union movement will need to be convinced very quickly that a decisive and different approach is coming in 2023. Should that fail to materialise, it's likely that there will be no viable alternative in profitable firms and in the public service to the pursuit of pay settlements as the norm that seek to fully compensate for the rate of inflation, with additional increases to reflect productivity growth. We are clear-eyed about the reality that there are hard decisions ahead, driven by inflation, international conflict, and a changing climate. Let's not squander an opportunity to prepare for a better, more secure future by working together. A core objective of the trade union movement is to ensure fairer wealth distribution while maintaining and improving living standards. As I've said, that doesn't have to involve conflict and disputes, but in the absence of effective tripartism, collective bargaining will be our only available avenue. We know that stronger trade union influence is associated with a larger share of income going to labour. This is because unions increase the bargaining power of workers, which offsets the inherent bargaining advantage held by the employer. This in turn reduces inequality because labour income is more evenly distributed than capital income, and in addition, trade union influence leads to wage compression within firms and sectors, and this too facilitates greater economic equality. Greater equality itself is associated with a range of things, including quality of life and well-being, and benefits economy and society as a whole. Brings about greater social trust, increased life expectancy and happiness, and lower levels of crime and stress. Inequality also intensifies distributional conflicts, thereby making society less inherently stable. The absence of trade unions and collective bargaining creates a vacuum in which workers' voices are ignored in the firm, in the media, and in the halls of power. This engenders frustration, a turn to populism, and ultimately to political and economic dead ends like Trump and Brexit. A strong trade union movement generating and producing consistent gains for workers is therefore a key component of a healthy, inclusive economy and a healthy democracy. And it's a sad fact that the decline in trade union organisation at a global level mirrors the decline in the share of wealth going to labour rather than capital over the last 40 years or so. Trade unions understand that inflation comes with costs and that monetary policy is tightening. But central banks must also protect the real economy. Failure to engage with workers and failure to put full employment on a par with low inflation risks an unnecessary recession, the spectre of populism, and more short-term policy and decision-making. And I think, in relation to populism, what's really noteworthy that it's increasingly coming from the right as much as the left, and sometimes, strangely enough, even from within government. So, to conclude, I therefore greatly welcome today's dialogue, and I look forward to the discussion and to the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kevin. Excellent points there and a really good response. And just to talk you through what's going to happen next, we have a little over half an hour, which is great. It's a good bit of time. I'm going to put a few questions to both of our speakers, but then I do want to throw it open to the floor. So I hope you have questions there ready to go. Let's begin, I suppose, by giving a chance to rebut the rebuttal, if you wish. Sharon, a couple of things I took from Kevin's address there. ECB policymakers, don't go too far too fast. Don't make the same mistakes that we saw during the crash, and remember those most in need in your policy decisions. What do you say to those comments from Kevin?
Well, maybe a couple of things. I want to speak up on a few points and then I'll come to that. So the first thing is, I did talk about the distribution effects myself. I hope you can hear me. And often I think when we talk as central bankers and I'm talking about data in the macro economy, it can feel, I think, sometimes like we don't remember that the economy is ordinary people. Okay, the economy is people, households, businesses, from small businesses to big corporates. So I do think these distributional points that Kevin made are very important. He also, towards the end, talked about resilience. I mean, I didn't mention it in my own remarks today. It is something we talk about a lot at the bank. And I think we find ourselves, you said it at the beginning, Brian, this very unusual situation. We've had this sequence of crisis, the global financial crisis, Brexit, which obviously had very significant effects, and the potential, I think, if it had been a harder Brexit, to have even more negative effects in Ireland, the pandemic and the war. And for us in the bank, the sort of gaps between the crises getting smaller and smaller. So when you think about resilience in the economy and some of the issues that Kevin talked about, I think it's really important also to remember that in terms of the risk outlook for the economy, the things that are happening, these are very significant events. They've come very quickly. And so continuing to build resilience, being prudent, looking at these distributional issues, I think are all very important. The thing about the distribution effects as well, I think, is both the pandemic and the current sort of cost of living pressures that we're seeing have had sort of concerning interactions in terms of the distribution effects. Of course, in the pandemic, a lot of the workers who were out of work, and of course were supported by the government interventions and so on, but tended to be at that sort of lower end of the distribution and so on, and now we see that again. So I do think these distribution effects are very important to consider, and certainly in terms of fiscal policy, I think our strong view in the bank is that fiscal measures have to target those who are absolutely most affected. On the not too far too fast, so first of all, I think we are, and I said it in my remarks, like absolutely committed to the inflation target for all the reasons that I mentioned, but also what Kevin mentioned as well, which is this is the best way, I think, to deal with the current challenges in the economy and to make sure that over the longer term our growth and so on is more sustainable. Low, stable inflation is absolutely critical to kind of economic growth and welfare overall. So we are absolutely committed to that. I think the reason for this meeting by meeting approach that I talked about, very data dependent, is exactly this. It's making sure that the policy mix is really calibrated to the circumstances. It's one of the reasons why I think some of the work that Ray did yesterday in terms of understanding what's going on in the labour market is so important, because a lot of data does lag and therefore it can be hard sometimes to know what exactly is going on in the economy right now. So some of these indicators, I think, that can give us a better feel for the economy right now is very important in our decision making to get this sort of policy mix right. But for us, dealing with inflation is the kind of core objective, and making sure that that is done in a way, I think, that's kind of consistent with a long run stable outlook, which is best for everyone.
Just sticking on the inflation theme, and it's a communications question. I thought you did a really good job there of taking that energy point and saying, but energy feeds into this, it feeds into this, and it feeds into everything. Is there a danger out there that the public looks at this and says, it's energy, it's the war in Ukraine, so why are you putting up my mortgage every month? This has nothing to do with me. Is there a disconnect between the public's understanding of what you guys are doing and what's happening in the real world in terms of inflation?
So I think, first of all, people understand very well what's happening in their own pockets and their own budgets, and understand, I think, very well the effects that inflation has on them, whether it's their sort of energy bills or their food bills or anything else. So in fact, we find in times of high inflation, even going back in past decades, that particularly actually for lower income households, they're acutely aware of kind of where the inflation pressures in terms of their own pocket are coming from. I think central banks over the last sort of 10, 15 years, there's been a really big debate around how they communicate, how they explain what they're doing. And a lot of central banks, including the ECB and ourselves, I think have really tried to sort of explain better what we're doing, explain better what's going on in the economy. And why does that matter? Because it's also related to expectations. And I think as we've both been saying, if expectations of inflation sort of drift away from 2%, then we do risk getting into this sort of very problematic wage price spiral. So we see our communications and trying to explain what we're doing and trying to help people understand what we're doing as being really important to how we sort of form expectations in the economy. Now, having said that, you know, I am conscious that a lot of time what we talk about maybe seems a bit complex and a bit remote, but just to say again, I think we are very grounded in understanding that, you know, these decisions really affect people. And I think President Lagarde, when she was here in the last couple of weeks, including when she did some media herself when she was here, was kind of really clear on that. That is, I think, to the fore of our mind when we think about the decisions that we make.
Kevin, the dreaded wage price spiral got mentioned a couple of times in the context of the 60s and the 70s. You both referenced it in your speech, and you both said it's different this time round. Can you, and I'm going to come to both on this, just briefly synopsis, what is different now this time compared to the 60s and 70s and that wage price spiral that we saw?
I mean, the first thing that's different is the world is different. You know, the nature of the economy is different. But part of that is the share of wealth going to labour is much, much less than it was back 40, 50 years ago. Obviously, there's more wealth, but the share of it going to labour is much less. So we've had the whole experience of globalisation and all that has meant. But I suppose, you know, in terms of the point, it's really that it's clear that, you know, what's happening at the moment is not, you know, the situation that developed over time, I suppose, in the 70s and 80s, that there was almost a generalised expectation that inflation was going to be there and was going to be worse, and it was factored into wage bargain, you know, whereas what's happening now is, you know, attempts, you could say, whether they've been successful or not, but to mitigate the effect of inflation. So I was very clear in terms of the recent public service negotiation that we were not going to match inflation this year. You know, obviously members made their own judgments in the round, but even if you know the increase had been 8% this year, which is the predicted level of inflation, you know, in real terms that would still be a reduction, because it's not 8% into the pocket, it's 8% gross with all the deductions. So it's a, you know, there's an oversimplification of a lot of this, not just in the media, but I suppose in general discourse as well. And that's why I think, you know, today's lecture, and I think Sharon's exposition of the issues involved is really important, you know, that we have, you know, we sometimes think on the worker side that, you know, central bankers and all of these institutions are the enemy. In fact, you know, we all need access to the knowledge to develop our respective bargaining positions.
Kevin said, you know, sometimes it's the lazy politician thing to do or the lazy columnist in a newspaper thing to do. It'll be the 60s and the 70s again, wage price spiral. I mean, that you clearly said that is not, this today is different, is it not?
Today is very different. But I suppose what I'm pointing to is, it's our job as trade unions to do the best to protect workers' living standards and to do the best for our members, and that's what we'll do. And if we don't have an other viable, credible alternative, then we'll do that solely through wage bargaining where we can and get the best pay deals that we can. But actually, if we had a deeper form of dialogue between government employers and unions around these issues, it's possible to actually, improve living standards by a combination of things other than just solely wages.
And Sharon, you'd agree the 60s, 70s, different time now.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of things. Kevin touched on them. Some of them, I think the world is different, the structure of the economy is different. Some of the factors that are sort of underlying this, particularly coming out of the pandemic and some of the issues that we've had more recently, are a bit different. I would also say the institutional structure is different. So that's very true for us being in the euro area now, but also even the role of central banks, I think globally has changed a lot. Independence of central banks and their kind of commitment and credibility around an inflation target. The other thing is, I think, and I hope people haven't forgotten, it's one of the things we worry about most in central banks in general, is that people forget the crisis in the past.
Yep.
And part of our job is to keep reminding people of the risks. I think people do remember and understand some of the challenges of getting into this kind of wage price spiral and just how negative that can be. And so I think even some of the things that Kevin has said about the thinking of the approach of the trade union movement and many others, I think is quite different. People are acutely aware, I think, that we really don't want to end up there. And there is, I think, as you've been saying, this kind of collective responsibility on all of us to play our parts. And definitely one of our jobs in the central bank, although it can sound sometimes, I think, that we're being quite negative, is to talk about risks to the future, is to talk about resilience in the economy, resilience in the public finances, and also to recall painful lessons from the past about trying to avoid kind of repeating those mistakes into the future.
I don't want to over-dwell on tech. To be fair, it wasn't a huge part of what we were talking about today, but it is very topical right now, and it is in the media. And Sharon, in your speech, you referenced Ray's research yesterday, which showed that tech wages starting to dip, demand for tech workers starting to dip, and of course it's been all over the headlines for the last week. Kevin, I might start with you on this. The tech sector typically isn't very well union represented. I'm sure you'd say, oh, if they were, they'd have been treated a lot better over the last week. But in the broader theme of things, we saw a couple of examples in the last few days of billionaires deciding that it was the worker who was going to get it in the neck and be shoved aside as the disposable asset when things went wrong. Is that not what the trade union movement was designed to change, to move us away from that entire world of where the boss mistreats the little guy when things go bad?
I think so, and that's why, to be very clear, the absence or general absence of the trade union movement from this part of growing part of the economy is a big problem that I flagged up when I was taking up the presidency last year. It's one of the 5 areas that I think we have to become more active in, and we were quick to respond. So I think there is a change that it's very hard to put your finger on, but it's taking place, that people generally, whether they're trade union members or citizens or workers generally, are looking to the trade union movement to speak up and stand up for them. I think that was happening this year. I definitely felt it, because there was a fair profile, largely due to yourself, Brian, over the negotiation we were involved in. But it was people who weren't in the public service also, interested and supportive of what we were trying to do, because they saw what we were trying to do as necessary and fair. And I think we would see, a new opportunity now that more people will think twice about, whether they should be collectively organised and what their relationship to the organised trade union movement will be in firms such as the ones we've seen. So,
Sharon, the tech blip, is it a blip? Is it going to have a big ramification? I'm thinking as well, of course, of the corporate taxes, the income taxes that these very well-paid workers will not now be paying to the state. How concerned are you at policy level that there could be something happening in that sector that could have wider ramifications?
Yeah, so look, as I said in my remarks, we obviously look at the labour market very carefully to understand what's going on there. The tech sector has grown very, very rapidly over the last number of years. In fact, during the pandemic, I think we called out repeatedly that the tech sector and pharma, for example, were some of the things that was really contributing to resilience and economic growth, and while many other workers, for example, weren't able to work because of the lockdowns. So there has been this very, very strong growth over the last number of years. I think at the moment it's some very specific firms. Of course, they are very large firms, and it's very difficult for the people that are involved. But as I said in my remarks, we are talking about a labour market that is generally speaking very tight. We have the highest level of employment ever in the history of the state. So I'd say we are watching it carefully, but it would certainly seem, I think, that even in other sectors, you know, there is still kind of job opportunities and so on. I would emphasise what you mentioned yourself there. One of the key things that we look at in terms of the economy is the sort of role of multinationals in the economy, which is very significant. People often talk about corporate taxes, and I mean, you mentioned it there as well, but also other things like income tax, very important, and also the effect that these large employers have on the wider economy. So many small and medium enterprises, I mean, for many of these companies, Intel in Ixlet, for example, they're actually very integral to the local economy. So I'd say watching carefully.
I want to talk a little bit about remote work and working from home. I'll stay with you, Sharon, on this. A really interesting line that I took from your address was looking at some data in the US that shows working from home could lead to a pay cut. Is that the case? Is this something that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the whole debate about sort of work after the pandemic, very significant, particularly in terms of what some of the longer term structural effects may be in the labour market. I mean, interestingly on this, I think we saw at the time when sort of lockdowns were happening and so on, some employers in the US actually saying, you know, if people left large cities or if they went to other parts of the US, there would be reductions in pay, and that was even part of what was being discussed at the time. What we see now, I think, is this kind of interesting research about, you know, what is the benefit of the opportunity or the option to work from home where you can have that, and a bit to what you've been talking about, you know, how is that benefit distributed between the employer and the employee. So, you know, to get the additional flexibility or to work outside of a big city or somewhere else away from the office, you know, is there a kind of effect then in terms of lower wages, so kind of cost to you of the added flexibility? It's an emerging area of research. I think it's something, certainly in terms of understanding the labour market post the pandemic, is something that we should certainly continue to look into.
A pay cut to work from home, Kevin Callinan. I'm sure you're delighted with that idea.
Yeah, well, obviously when the phenomenon kind of took off, this is something that we were acutely aware of the potential for it. But I think, you know, we need to also consider, I mean, another aspect of this is, you know, in terms of the ability, even as a union as an employer to attract and retain staff, you know, making that available is an important factor. So there's two sides to it. And I think this is something that hasn't fully found its level yet, but and it's a challenge for the trade union movement. Let's be very clear. You know, organising people collectively is a lot easier when everybody's in the same building than when they're spread around. But maybe just to share a little bit of personal anecdote. Like a lot of people here, probably, you know, I have the experience of children growing up, leaving, going to work and moving out, and then coming back because of the housing situation largely. So at the moment, we have a 30-year-old back with us, works in the private sector, and boy does she work hard. And when she is locked away in that office on our calls, she could be there till 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. And now, of course, the employer wants to move back to in the office 3 days as well. So it's like the worst of all worlds. No union, you know, and you know, there's another side to this as well that you know is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for the trade union.
Can I keep you on remote work, Kevin? And just again, a timely question. As you saw yesterday, the government announced that its remote working bill would be merged into the work-life balance bill. And people remember the remote working bill was a bit controversial because there was 13 reasons to say no. So the union said, look, it's too much, there's too many, it's in the employer's favour. The employers actually didn't like it either because they said it's administrative burden. But what the government has done is they've merged into the work-life balance bill, which removes the 13 reasons to say no, but instead they will have to comply with the code of conduct that isn't drawn up yet. Is it a bit of a fudge? They've sort of, I feel anyway, they've removed this sort of reasons to say no, which is fine, and people are happy about that. But now it's in the ether, now it's in the abstract, and they'd have to abide by a code of conduct that isn't drawn up yet. What was your own reaction to the remote working legislation?
Well, in general, we've welcomed the fact that there's been a very clear move away from what we saw as rather than a right to grant, a right to reject remote working. So we see that as appropriate, and I think locating it in that piece of legislation probably makes sense. But obviously, as you say, the devil's going to be in the detail, and the jury will probably be out until we see the final shape of it.
Can I ask a wider question about the Workplace Relations Commission? I hear they're mentioned all the time now. Every time the government introduces something new, be it sick pay, be it gender pay, closing the gender pay gap, domestic violence leave, the final line of the press releases, and then it'll go to the Workplace Relations Commission, it'll be sorted out there. Are they becoming overburdened? Is the WRC getting its adequate resourcing? Because it seems, am I correct, that more and more is being piled on their plate in terms of employment?
Well, as the employment law has become more extensive and the procedures around it more cumbersome, I suppose that there's no doubt that's the case. I'm probably not the best person to answer that, but I would say you're probably right. There probably is a deficit in resources there, something that needs to be addressed.
Sharon, I want to come to the very core specific topic back again, if you don't mind, on wages. And what I found interesting was you sort of spoke about the second round effect versus the third and the fourth round effect. So the second round effect, maybe there will be a pay increase to meet inflation. Just explain, what is the third and fourth? Is it just crudely you go too far? You start increasing wages too much? Maybe talk us through that concept.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what I talked about in the remarks, a bit also what Kevin was talking about, there is, I think, a sort of catch-up effect. Okay, people have obviously had a decline in their real incomes. As I said, we are basically all worse off by particularly what's happened in Ukraine and the energy price effects, but also more generally in terms of our real incomes because of inflation. So you do get this sort of catch-up effect. I think the concern is particularly if people looking to the future are concerned also that inflation is going to persist, then they also start to look towards sort of future wage negotiations. And then also, as inflation is taking off, firms are also looking at the prices that they're charging in the economy in terms of producer prices. So do these sort of begin a kind of mutually reinforcing dynamic, so that in the next wage discussion, we're so worried about future inflation that actually, employees begin looking for more, and sort of on it goes. And that is part of what we've kind of experienced in the past. So you get this problematic kind of dynamic. And that's why I think I agree with what Kevin said, sort of responsibility on us all, central banks in taking sort of firm action to deal with this, how do employees, how do employers, how do governments, etc., all respond, because chasing inflation or outrunning it, as Kevin called it, I think becomes very problematic, and that's how you get into these sort of other effects in the cycle.
Kevin, you mentioned looking ahead to next year, you will be back around the talks table on the public sector pay talks. I mean, where is that going to go? Because, by all indicators, the economy may well be in a more difficult place. The global economy certainly be in a more difficult place. The government may not have that corporate tax windfall that it did this year. Are you girding your loins for a tougher negotiation next year when it comes to the public pay talks, the ones that you are directly personally involved in?
Well, I think it's too early to say, but I mean, right now the state is in a very, very good fiscal position. So obviously, I think it's right, probably, as Sharon said, to say that the broader, beyond Ireland shores, comments about the prospects for next year are having kind of an effect in terms of sentiment, probably on both sides of the bargaining table. I thought myself that, the way in which the Bank of England announcement was announced and kind of just how, the emphasis on the prolonged recession was something that was heard, I think, by both sides of the table here. But I think from an Irish point of view right now, I would say, as I was saying, I don't think we can have a situation next year where the government just, approaches this on the basis of spending a whole load of money in an untargeted way, engages in tax cuts at a time when everybody knows, we need to invest in our infrastructure, in our services, and, certainly we will do the best we can, whether it's in the public or private sectors now. I think, there will be a reassessment at Congress level by our private sector committee over the coming weeks about the approach for next year as well. So I think this year could be seen as a once-off. I made a speech on the 6th of October last year, actually, to the PD Fórsa conference where, and Minister Coveney happened to be present, where actually drew attention to the uptick in inflation and the fact that I thought that that was going to be an important issue in bargaining for this year, which proved to be the case. None of us at that stage would have known about it.
Would have been 8 and 9% and everything. Yeah.
But I think next year will have to be different.
I'm just going to do one more from me and then I will throw it open to the floor. I just want to tease out very quickly the idea of hoarding staff now. Is that a thing where you would hire people you don't necessarily need for fear that you will need them in the future?
It's partly also about holding on to workers that you already have. So particularly, I mean, the central bank is not forecasting a recession in Ireland. I mean, there is some, I think, downside risk, of course, but of course a slowdown, but not necessarily a recession for next year. But the idea that if employers think that there is going to be a slowdown, but it's going to be temporary, given how tight the labour market is, maybe how difficult it is to get specific skills that they want or need, that they'll sort of hold on to people, even though, maybe in another circumstance they think about letting workers go, particularly if they think any sort of slowdown is going to be temporary.
Okay, on that note, we have to leave it because we have run over time. I would like please to give a very warm round of applause for our two really good speakers today, Sharon Donnery and Kevin Callinan. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I thought that was great. The time flew and I'm sorry we ran out of time, but thanks so much for coming. I believe there's a lunch, is that right? Lunchtime. Thanks very much, guys. Thank you.